Darren Boyd, and we also have Satbir Strong. Darren and Satbir are co-hosts of the Incubator podcast and creators of a think tank which promotes thought leadership on socio-technical themes, concepts, and technologies that matter to the modern enterprise. Hope you enjoyed the session, and now I'll pass it on to Aaron.
Thank you. A little bit of background before we get started is Darren Satbir and I actually did an episode of their podcast, which you see the name of, Incubator, right in between them. You can actually go find that on YouTube, episode 6. And this is sort of an inverse of that conversation. So to set the groundwork, they interviewed me about my operational and incident command experience and, kind of the challenges I had and what I needed out of observability. But one of the things we didn't cover in there was the observability side, because I'm not an observability guy, never have been. But you guys actually, know a lot about observability. You're part of certain communities that are trying to adopt open standards. And then you also consult with companies and kind of help them strategize around what they're doing. So I wanted to interview you guys about, the challenges faced on that side of the table and, how observability could enable the things we talked about in the first one for the outcomes that I would need as, your frontline responder. So with that, maybe something that we could do at the top of it is define observability. And I don't know if you guys agree on the definition, but Darren, I'll start with you. What is observability for you?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having us. We're excited, and it is fun to be on this side. Hard to go after that video, by the way. I see some comments. People really like that opening intro. So it's interesting. I've kind of gone back and forth on a definition, and what I found was I was applying a definition for where observability was being applied. So, for example, we do a lot of our customers. Satbir and I do a lot of consulting in this space. We typically are dealing with observability in the application and infrastructure space, but we all know that that's not the be all end all of observability. I'm going to start calling it Ollie because it doesn't roll off the tongue otherwise. So there's data Ollie, there's model Ollie, there's business transaction Ollie, but typically when we talk, for the most part, we're talking about applications and infrastructure. So because Ollie can be applied to so many domains, I like to come back to the classic control definition because I think it generally applies to any domain that you're speaking about. So when I look at observability, it's still the inferring an internal state of your system from external outputs. Now, I know that sounds pretty sanitized, but if you really peel back, I'm going to say that historically, organizations are really good at post hoc capability, right? We're really good at seeing an event and then diving in and trying to triage and find root cause. Where we're starting to get better is in the ad hoc capability. And so being able to ask your system questions that you may not have pre-canned and building that inquisitiveness with your ecosystem, I think is where observability starts to become prevalent. And so it is that classic unknowns versus the known unknowns. So that would be my definition of the space. And what I like about that, just that inquisitive asking questions, is it does generally apply to any of the domains you want to assign Ollie to. So I think that works broadly speaking.
And Satbir,
Yeah,
any disagreement?
Oh, no disagreement. I would say the ability to ask your system any questions and understand what is actually going on. But from a practical or pragmatic standpoint, the IT ops is evolving as the infrastructure and organization architectures are evolving as well. Traditional monolithic applications now decomposed into microservices. How do you actually understand a component in your overall application stack that may be faltering out and everything like that? It's not as simple as a red, yellow, green type of alert. You need to be able to, of course, have that visibility correlated that something is wrong on the front end of it, but the ability to ask those questions, double click into the various components, and have that visibility to understand where or what you're dealing with versus, hey, my whole application is down. Well, maybe your whole application isn't down. Maybe a fraction of it is down or a component of it is down. So how do you get to that level?
I'd also add on that if I'll just take the opportunity. Aaron, you cut me off whenever you want. When we're looking at, like, when we're dealing with our customers, they're very complex customers, and they have, if you look at any organization of any appreciable size, you've got different cohorts of capability as well. And we're seeing more and more folks are moving to domain driven design. They're moving to product mode. And so you've got these really interesting boundaries. You have various team topologies that stripe across, but you've got these interesting boundaries. And if you look at any one product team, they're probably very good. They have the intimacy, and they're really developing the skills to troubleshoot anything that happens in that domain. But as Satbir was saying, as we get more and more complex architectures, we're finding that obviously a transaction can extend well beyond product team boundaries. And so when you start getting away from what I control and into other aspects of the business, how do you stitch together that story? And how do you ask questions there? And another I'm going to keep going. Another thing that I think is we're finding as a trend just in the observability space is like I think it was Synopsys put out the OSRA report recently. And in there, it showed even in commercial code base, there's I think it was like 97% of commercial code base had open source components. What we're finding is, I'm not saying it's easier, but it's getting faster to create some of these architectures. They're getting complex. We've seen everything from, as Satbir said, microservices to stage event driven architectures. So it's getting more complex. We can stitch them together faster with some of these open source libraries. And then we've got these boundaries that don't exist from a transaction perspective. That is exceptionally difficult to be able to actually ensure that the application is up and running. And that's where observability really takes hold.
Crystal clear or
So,
clear as mud?
Yeah.
well, I was going to say one of the things you mentioned that I've seen is a common, let's say, challenge, is heavily siloed teams, but not a heavily siloed product. So while the teams are working on individual components, like you mentioned, or services, microservices, the application is just one whole, and their service is a part of that. And so it's like the boundaries of the team is actually just a hop in the app experience or online experience, whatever that may be. What are some of the other challenges you see, maybe at a high level, some other trends that you see that companies are trying to solve on the observability side? Are there other commonalities in the challenges?
Yeah. Do you want to
Go
go
for it.
Okay. So it's interesting when we start talking about trends. Trends in this space can go across multiple dimensions. We can talk about trends in the space itself, because there's a lot happening right now. There's a lot of things we're seeing in that space. And then you've got, of course, the trends of what our customers starting to do. It's actually kind of timely. I think 2 days ago, I don't have the stats familiar yet, but Splunk and ESG just put out State of Observability, and it's interesting in that space. The problem we're trying to solve may not be evolving, right? We're trying to, in the case of app and infrastructure, right, just separating again Ollie to that space. I think most of us at Resolve are more concerned with that. The trend is to deliver and operate software efficiently. I think the growing, I guess what we could say, the growing trend in how people are doing that is the recognition that observability is a differentiator. So we're seeing, even if you look in that report, there is some wonderful stats on people doing observability well and what it means to the business. Wonderful stats. But I think if you look at some of the nuance in that report, it is starting to show, and we're seeing it in the field, people are recognizing that this can help them with time to market. It can help with new product introduction. It's a classic rising tide raises all ships. It can help with resilience architectures and patterns, right? Resilience engineering as a whole is now starting to be applied to software, which gets really interesting, right? It was in more critical systems. Now we're bringing resilience engineering to software. Ollie can help with that. It can help with the regression and performance management of code. It can help with central tendency and uptime and some of the quantitative values. And so we're seeing an evolution on how people are applying this. But we're also seeing some really interesting trends in the space, and we can always get into that as well if there's interest. But the problem still exists. It's just getting more difficult. When I had a monolith, that's very different than what we've just been talking about, which is application teams with in many ways, they have the P&L. It's a product team. They own their product, and they have various slices of support functions within their domain of authority, but they're interacting with all sorts of other product teams. As you said, there are defined boundaries in some cases. Sometimes the tools can stretch across. Sometimes people are using their own tools. We work with one customer that has one product team, has 12 tools they use to manage their product, and none of them are being used by other product teams. Very, very complex to stitch that together. So I'll end on that one.
Yeah, and just to add from what Darren mentioned, I guess from a trend for a number of years, Aaron, it was we needed to have that single pane, that manager of managers coming off of maybe legacy environments, the NetCools of the world, the HP OpenViews, which is important for organizations to have a common screen, and it worked for that. Let's call it traditional monolithic environment for monitoring, and then the environment around us all evolved, the ecosystem, where in order to monitor, you had a proliferation of additional tools. So the manager of managers, in a way, was not successful as technology advanced, and you had kind of microservices-driven architectures, distributed architectures formulate. However, now you see both sides coming together with observability, which is you have these specific technologies and tools that allow you to ask questions, build in metrics, traces, logs, melt data effectively, bring that in. But it doesn't take away. Now it actually complements that single pane view of an aggregation layer better to work along with the specialization of those observability technologies. But that single pane becomes equally important because you do have so many different tools and signals coming in. So how do you bring it together? I think in a way you had to go through this evolution, and now that single pane is becoming more prevalent again on the front end of things, maybe the front layer to observability, front ending all of those technologies behind it as an aggregator, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I'll say there is the birth of AI ops, right? Like there's actually
well, I was going to say we'll get to that. You're jumping the gun a little
okay.
bit, but well, the question I wanted to ask you really is, um, and this was posed in the chat as well. We hear it on the Big Panda side. I'm sure you hear this too. But what do we do first? It's a chicken and the egg problem. Do I need an observability single pane of glass platform? Do I need it, for my ops team, or do I need all these observability tools and signals? What comes first, or do they go together? What's your perspective on what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
So this is the perfect question. I love this question because there's I'm going to speak a little bit in generalities, but it's something that Satbir and I have had a lot of success in rinsing and repeating for organizations.
By the way, it depends.
No, it does. And there's a lot that goes into it, including where are your capabilities as an organization. But I will say, generally speaking, there is a formula that seems to work, and I'll outline it. So the first thing that we always advocate for is generally decouple your source to sink. I'm a big fan of decoupling some of the vendor lock-in, and so one of the first things we always talk about is make yourself vendor neutral. And there's multiple ways to do that, but I will generally say put in an observability pipeline that can start to separate source to sink. That doesn't necessarily mean you can decouple from any particular vendor. And the reason I like to talk about decoupling source to sink is because many organizations, part of the mandate, right? There is a user challenge we need to solve, but there's also the realities of working in an organization, and many have a mandate to rationalize some of those tools. That is almost impossible to do unless you start to decouple source to sink. So that's a first place I always like to start. The other reason I like to start there is we work with organizations that have tens of thousands of different endpoints emitting different data sources. There's agent-based, there's streaming-based, there's batch-based. There's all sorts of different sources that have to be introduced. And so that will influence how you decouple your source to sink via an observability pipeline. From there, we tend to bifurcate our strategy. Again, this depends on the capability of the organization, but we like to go and talk about how are you collecting signals. So telemetry propagation, signal emission, there's a whole strategy around that piece. The other side is, and the reason that's important, by the way, is if I've decoupled source to sync by putting in an observability pipeline, and there's many ways to do that, but I'm using vendor specific libraries on telemetry collection, then arguably I still have a fight. I still have to somehow convince developers to go in and potentially pull out some of that code. So we talk about signal emission and telemetry collection, while we talk about aggregation and event correlation. So observability pipeline, aggregation is the AIOps space. What I love about AIOps, and I'm going to put a plug to BigPanda because I enjoy what they're doing in the space. What I love about it is it can aggregate all of the feeds from all those multiple tools, right? I haven't done anything. I haven't rationalized. Ideally, I want to get that down to a manageable number. And ideally, I want one tool to feed. However, that's not realistic. And there's reasons to have multiple tools. But something like that aggregation layer means now everybody can get familiar and we can drive automation in the aggregation side while we now have decoupled the vendor dependencies, which means we can make rationalizations without impacting the user. I find, as we work with our customers, if you don't do that, you are looking at a 36-month unwinding of all of your tools if rationalization is a part of the challenge. The other interesting thing is, if you're focusing on AIOps and event correlation, there's additional value from integrating with topology, various topology integrations, by integrating with change. Like, there's incredible value. You can put your frontline in it. You can put your product teams in this event correlation layer, and now you can tackle the rest of the tools. Yeah. That was winded.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit here and clarify some of the things that Darren mentioned. So that completely agree that an organization can start by decoupling source to sync. And what does that really mean? So the sources are all of your telemetry signal data coming from endpoints. And for example, in a Splunk architecture, you might talk about all your telemetry coming from your universal forwarders, right? Or syslog, or any of your other endpoints that are generating telemetry and signals and going to various destinations. Typically, again, in this Splunk environment, you're sending it either to your SIEM or your IT ops platform that was there from a Splunk standpoint. But if you were to put a observability pipeline that serves as a collection or routing function for all that telemetry, now you could still send it to Splunk. You could still send it to any aggregator function, such as, like Darren mentioned, like a BigPanda, which can actually give you that collective view of what's happening in your universe. So while no disagreement in terms of starting from an observability pipeline, the other side is that, well, organizations might have a much more chaotic environment going on today, cannot really undertake that project of putting that pipeline and routing in place. Well, that aggregation function or AIOps function and correlation on the front end can simplify it if you build a lot of taking in some of that telemetry coming in, and you might not have it from a single source or a pipeline, but all your various sources coming in. Now you have a composite view, let's call it a single pane, that gives you a better view into your environment. Now you can start building your dashboarding there, hopefully reducing your MTTR and some of those things on the front end of things, and then working back, top down, if you will, and building the various components of an observability pipeline in the behind the scenes. So two different, bottoms up, top down ways of looking at things.
Yeah, lots of ways to skin this too, by the way. There's commercial off the shelf, there's open standards and open source objectives there as well, and possibilities. So we can definitely go down that path if there's interest.
There is a question in chat. You mentioned decoupling source to sync a few times. Do you have an example for the audience of what you mean by that?
Yeah. So and I think that's where Satbir was going with his statement. Oftentimes we rely on this. This is going to get into a much bigger segment. Oftentimes we rely on the engineering of commercial off-the-shelf platforms to collect signals and route to certain destinations. So the example that Satbir was giving with universal forwarders, heavy forwarders, maybe you're collecting from maybe using agents, maybe it's Dynatrace agents, Datadog agents, whatever it is. You now have a reliance on that vendor. right? So if I put in their infrastructure, then I'm relying on that vendor's infrastructure. There are ways to start to separate the source and how you're collecting the source from where you're sending it to by putting these shims in between. These shims can be open source shims, they can be commercial shims. There's lots of ways to do that, but the benefit is multifold. One, you can now use potentially a much broader set of collection techniques, and we can get into that piece. When you send to your observability pipeline, you send once, and now you can do, it's a pipeline, and so you can do various activities along the way. You can transform it, you can enrich it, you can remove superfluous data, you can shape it, you can do all these pieces. You can put layers of guardrails in place. We often, as we're doing this part, we tie it back to your control statements, your IT narratives, et cetera. So you've got a codified set of guardrails. When it comes out the other end, I can send to multiple destinations, which allows greater experimentation, it allows greater flexibility, and I've only sent in once and can cascade to many. And so that's what we mean by source to sink. And now it means you've got flexibility. I can pull out any vendor now, right? Like I can use FluentD, I can use Fluent Bits, I can use whatever Beats, I can use whatever agent now. I can use open source, I can still use a vendor, right? And there's still value to that. But now the choice is back with us, right? And so now that we've captured it, and once you put the guardrails in place, you now achieve something else, which is traditionally, and I'm not saying this is wrong, traditionally IT controls the destinations. But what we first talked about, we talked about organizations are now having more and more responsibility at the product team level. So I'm not saying you should open the spigot to allow them to experiment and operate, because they're responsible. Like we're seeing it more and more. They're responsible for the maintenance and care of their product end to end. But oftentimes IT will say, but you can only send it to this destination. So you have the ability, not saying you should, to open the spigot and say, you can now be performant using tools of your choice, because I have already controlled via guardrails all of the aspects of that data, right? So if you're exposing, for example, PII, when you're emitting your signals, I've already captured it. I've already obfuscated. I've already gone back to your team now and said, hey, you're sending it clear text. We took care of it. You need to fix it at source, but they can send to any destination now. We're seeing a lot of folks, well, even in that aspect, they'll send to an end state, then they'll perform obfuscations or something else and processing. That observability pipeline really opens the flexibility to the org as a whole.
Yeah, one other point to add there is the pipeline is important from an IT ops perspective and AI ops and all of those things, as we might call it, just from a observability standpoint. But observability isn't just from an operational standpoint. The ability to have this pipeline as a routing function allows different subscribers. So when we say source to sink, think of it in a way akin to pub sub. You can have other product teams, as Darren mentioned before, that would like to application teams that subscribe to certain data feeds, irrespective of what IT ops is taking in, right? So they can now get this telemetry. They might be a data team, they might be a different app team, they might be running their own analysis on their code. So it's not an IT ops function, but maybe it's something in build and in a dev environment where they're now observing their code in real time and getting feedback. And that is improving the ability to develop code and deliver code that ultimately you can identify issues, defects up front versus in an operational environment later, right? So you can have now this ability through this pipeline to take in that data, and it's not just for IT ops, it's for any product team. They can subscribe to that and they have that ability to get that feed. So now they've become observable, right? An organization is building that observability across it.
So a question came in as you guys were talking. You mentioned guardrails, setting up some guardrails and things. And the question is, what do you mean by guardrails? Are you referring to a common standardization of a data model or a normalization strategy, or is it more than that, or is that off the mark? What do you mean by guardrails, and can you give like maybe a specific example?
Yeah, we can mean a couple things. We can mean normally. What I mean by that is It has to do with your IT narratives. So if you've codified or if you have certain expectations that you've placed in your control statements, and it's stuff that you have to adhere to and report to the street, then we can start to take those and codify those. So a good example would be, hey, you have to send all security events to your SIEM. Okay, wonderful. At the pipeline, remember we said it's single source in, multi source out. We can take a full fidelity copy and send it to an observability lake, right? So before we do anything else to it, we've sent a full fidelity copy because your control statement says you have to replay and be able to triage events. So we send a full fidelity copy. Maybe the next control statement is saying, hey, you can't send PII information in plain text in your log structures. Great. So we can codify that. We can put obfuscation techniques. Maybe there's control statements about some enrichment aspects. So we can codify all those so that as things pass through your pipeline, those are the thou shalt nots. They're captured, they're codified, and you can report on those. And then you give flexibility to say, great, now that we've done all that, what would you like to do with your data product team, right? Who would you like to send it to? How would you like to process it? Because we have the assurance that we've controlled the flow of that data. Now, normalization and schema normalization may be a part of that. Maybe you say that everything has to be in Ceph format, and sure, we can enrich that. And there's other things we can do there. Whatever those guardrails look like to your organization, they can be codified in that observability pipeline. It's a very rich ability to process your data, and it enables so much in terms of protecting the organization while giving full flexibility to your product teams to operate as they need to.
So one of the things that you mentioned is, tool rationalization and kind of vendor agnosticism, my term, not yours necessarily. But let's say you get past that, your journey is done. You've got all these tools in place. You've got all these signals. What types of outcomes in a positive direction would some businesses see? What are some of the outcomes you see when someone's observability strategy matures?
Sure. So I would say that ultimately there's it depends on the organization. What are the key objectives? These days, when we talk about observability, we're looking for business outcomes. And by business outcomes, we're looking to improve the experience for application product teams. So it's adding that business value, minimizing defects, minimizing or increasing the chance of delivering sound code, right, to production and having less errors, if you will. And then certainly that trickles right back into it will reduce the IT ops environment or burden. And in order to get there, organizations have so many tools that have built up over time. Darren mentioned a particular organization that had 12 or 13 for a particular product team just for that organization. So what you're seeing now is the theme of, from one angle, if you can aggregate all of this telemetry. And we talked about this, and it goes back to the previous question around, well, why is observability? Where do you start in the organization? If you can actually start at the aggregation function, you can aggregate and correlate your telemetry. Now you are less dependent on the various sources sending you specific data because you're looking at a more of a single pane upfront environment. And then you can work back and you decouple, as we just talked about, through the pipeline. Hey, how is my telemetry coming in and where is it coming from? And how do I actually begin to, and with the trend in open telemetry concepts or open source, is take away the dependence on certain tools and technologies from a agent perspective. You can develop that independence as well. So that way you can now start to rationalize some of your tool sets or consolidate it. And we're not saying that you should go complete open source. It depends on your organization's ability to support that environment. But the constructs are out there for you to balance out further of saying a best of breed of both worlds. Where do I collect this telemetry and how do I route this telemetry? And then how do I aggregate and correlate this telemetry? And thereby, once you kind of build those pieces of a puzzle, you can figure out which technologies or platforms best suit your organization to start building a maybe a rationalization around tools and decoupling. So the first objective is really to decouple that dependence so you can rationalize. And a correlation function certainly helps you to do that. The pipeline helps you to do that. And then you can figure out based on your organizational needs, hey, what tools and technologies you really need, or where can you eliminate, because now you're focused on the actual signals versus which platform is producing them.
So I want to add a few things. So one is we talk a lot about central tendency metrics, right? Because they are important, they're quantitative, and they're reasonable to measure, and of course people love to see central tendency moving in the right direction. So that can be any MTTX. So as we say, hey, you've got all these tools in place, you're starting to do quote unquote observability. What does that start to look like as organizations tend up and to the right? One, your central tendency metrics, which are those quantitative ones, you're going to see improvements, and there's some pretty drastic improvements. Because, and I'm going to come back to the earlier statement, and I'm going to abuse my own statement, it's the rising tide element. When we start doing this right, we can start to influence other areas. So again, it's regression and performance management, right? As we're releasing code, we get to now observe things as we're releasing into these complex environments. We may even be able to fail our builds. We can certainly do testing of our observability ahead of time now. So there's some really interesting things there. It's going back after incident management, and I want to come back to incident management in a moment. It's coming back and it's influencing architectures going forward, which then, of course, positively impacts our central tendency metrics. So some really cool stuff starts to emerge as you're building this capability. But other things start to emerge more subtly, and people start to evolve central tendency metrics beyond the quantitative and into the qualitative. Some examples of that are, we're seeing organizations now get to a point where they can start measuring the human performance elements of this as well. So what's the weight of uncertainty, and what is the impact of time pressures during incidents, and what is the decision flow process that starts to follow? Observability also helps with those constructs, and that's really important for a lot of reasons. One is we put more and more on our developers. We have to protect against lost engineering cycles. And as we put more and more on them, these human factors become very interesting. We don't want to burn out our teams. We don't want to burn out our SREs. And so we're finding people start with central tendency, they get those improvements, but all aspects of your organization start to improve, including the original statement we were talking about is we're really good at post hoc. We can answer things after they've occurred. We're not as developed in ad hoc. Just, hey, I have some questions. I'd like to go and query this complex architecture. But that's an exceptionally interesting skill that observability starts to encourage in your employees. And so we find that's another benefit that inquisitiveness starts to weave into. We can more effectively manage our complex architectures, and our skill set starts to increase as well. So we're finding that's what happens when you start to do it right. But just to state, this is a continuous improvement, large depth of field domain. There is no end state. This is just a collective organization coming together around this domain, and everyone improves as a result. So it's an aspirational thing as well. There's real powerful captures along the way, but you're not going to be finished. But you will get the benefits early and along the journey that are going to feed into so many other areas.
Yeah, I like the you're continually on the journey, right? So like from an ops background, and I know I bring this up, I don't mean to throw any shade, but if you're ITIL certified, you go through this process of what is that maturity model, and they have this thing called continual service improvement. And so it's anytime you have something, whether it's working well or not, you should continuously look at it, because even something working well may not be perfect. There may be opportunities. And then the other thing you mentioned that resonated with me is kind of that I call it closed loop operations, right? So anything that is an event that becomes an alert, if it's critical enough, should become an incident. Anything that's an incident should have some sort of post review to figure out all the opportunities, and then those should become changes. Those changes may become events, may become alerts, incidents, etc. But it should feed into one another, and you should always be closing that loop with every scenario. Otherwise, you're leaving value on the table that may come and bite you later. So that really resonates with me when you say that as the operations guy, even though ITIL is kind of a dirty term. But there's a question in chat, and it's kind of related to something I mentioned at the top. I've been in a few conversations with both of you, and I hear open standards, open telemetry come up often for you. Can you just touch on that? Open telemetry maybe second. Start with open source. What's the value of open source in your mind? And then specifically open telemetry, which you brought up a few times. Then get into that maybe a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to say one thing before we go there too, Aaron, because you stirred something in me, which is when we look at even central tendency, we pride ourselves on how quick we can detect, and we pride ourselves on how quick we can resolve, and those are such important measures. There's of course additional central tendency that we could always look at, but to your closed loop statement, it's so important because when we do this right, you can even get to a point where you flip those two metrics. You can, because we now influence our architectures, and so we can self-heal before we even detect the issue once done right. And so you flip the D and the R, or you have the potential to flip the D and the R when you start to impact your architectures as a result of this closed loop. So that one's exceptionally important. So now coming to open source and open telemetry. This one is near and dear to our hearts. We spend a lot of time on this space, and a lot of it is personal passion. A lot of it is tracking what our customers are doing. More and more large customers are adopting FOSS, so free and open source software. As I said earlier, that OSPRA report said even in commercial code base, 97% of the code bases that were scanned by Synopsys had open source components, and of those, 78% of the entire code was actually open source. So we're authoring less and less of our code. More and more of it is open source. And there's a whole set of consequences to that. There's the executive order that came out by Biden. There's all sorts of things that we can get into in terms of conversation on what that looks like and what the impact of open source and so on and so forth. Open source in this context, we're seeing a lot of really interesting projects developed. The biggest one I'll talk about is open telemetry, though there are others. And the reason I like to talk about open telemetry is, one, it's not that old. It's a merging of open census and open tracing, but it's already the second largest project on CNCF. I ran DevStats, I think, the other day. I think they had almost 430,000 contributions to open telemetry. Now, where that is important, and this is just an opinion, where that is important is there is a lot of engineering cycles spent by commercial platforms to engineer the collection of data. And when I say data in this context, because we're talking about app and infrastructure observability, what I'm really talking about is metrics, logs, and traces. So every commercial platform has a group that is working on their agents so that they can collect the metrics, logs, and traces from various data sources. That is a lot of cycles that COTS teams have to apply to something that OpenTelemetry is starting to commoditize. So one aspect that I enjoy, like 430,000 contributions is massive. It's behind Kubernetes. That's the only other project that has more contribution than OpenTelemetry. So I'm a big fan on the commoditization of signal collection, because one, it means all of those other platforms, the ones that are supporting and starting to go all in, like Splunk is going all in on using OpenTelemetry as their collection. So you can imagine a world where eventually the UF fades away, maybe the HFs fade away from a Splunk perspective. So I'm a big fan of commoditizing the collection, because now those platforms can repurpose those engineering cycles into doing more innovation, right? And that's where their differentiation can be from an observability platform. The other thing I really enjoy about OpenTelemetry is they're stitching context and propagating context at source, meaning when I emit a log, a trace, a metric, I can use things called exemplars to tie them together at source. So when it's emitted, I can have that kind of connectivity already stitched in place. And so when it gets to our end tools, now the differentiation is, what do these platforms add to that equation. Now that we've commoditized collection, we make it much easier to bring in, I can now innovate in different ways on what do I do now that I've collected it, versus my agent sends me all the data and then I stitch it together once I get it. So the context propagation at the edge is really, really interesting. And so it's something we're seeing more and more. Most of our customers are at least experimenting with open telemetry. And when I say experimenting, the collection is a foregone conclusion for many of our customers. Not all, but for many of our customers. And again, you can imagine it depends on what capabilities do you have in your organization. If you're going down the open telemetry path or open source path, I hope you have staff that can know what that means and know how to interact with it. Not everybody does. So it's not for all, but telemetry collection is something that is almost a foregone conclusion. What is a little more in development is the pipeline. So we said earlier, there's open source pipelines, there's commercial off the shelf pipelines, and open telemetry you can use as a collector, you can use it as a pipeline, and you can do obfuscations, you can do statistical sampling, you can do transforms, enrichment, everything else. But now you're managing it. Now, certain vendors have their own version of an hotel collector, hotel pipeline to do these managements, but you could also do it completely open source. But there's other capabilities, like you could use Kafka, you could use Pulsar, you could build things yourself, and there's ways to do that as well. We've like Satbir and I have talked to customers about, hey, if you want to do this all open source, here's a version of what that could look like. That's exceptionally difficult. And then the question becomes, is that where you want to be spending all of your cycles and time? Just like I just claimed that maybe signal collection is not something that platforms should be spending a ton of time on because they can innovate elsewhere. I'd also suggest maybe doing everything open source is not where you want to be spending your time as an organization. But there are reasons for it, and there's insertion points.
Yeah, just to add a theme you had asked me before, Aaron, or the questions around rationalization. What Darren just mentioned is because of the commoditization of that collection function, you're decoupling from your current tool dependency at the for that, let's call it the agent dependency, thereby still allowing you to utilize these tools, but for what they may be good from, let's say, a visualization aspect of things, is how they infer that telemetry data individually. And therefore, it allows you to, at that point, start to figure out which tools maybe your application teams really like to use from an APM perspective, as an example, or from tracing aspects of things. So that helps from that vantage point. Again, this is an opinion, as Darren mentioned, that that's one aspect of maybe what the OTEL project that we really like is adopting that universal collector. Now the pipeline again can go either way, still being developed. But there is a question I think I see around: is it a hub? Effectively, yes. The pipeline becomes a hub and spoke architecture, enforcing guardrails or your compliance requirements. At the same time, delivering that telemetry data. The Security Operations Center wants all of that, right? So you send that there. Your front end management layer from an IT ops perspective would love that. Case in point, a BigPanda would absolutely want to ingest all that telemetry. That gives you frontline visibility. So they're going to take in everything. But having other subscribers, as I mentioned, the application product teams, well, they may not be reacting to any particular incident at all, but by way of engineering and development cycles to improve and minimize errors and improve the delivery of code, they're proactively observing their environment, their application, and understanding how it will perform either in dev and production. So they want to subscribe to this telemetry data as well, and take it appropriately. So it's a hub and spoke model, if you will.
Well, great. Unfortunately, we're at time, and I know the three of us could talk forever. But I wanted to thank you for doing this chat. I know if you're in the networking segment later on, where a lot of these viewers will be hanging out, they may have additional questions. But with that, yeah, I'll pass it back over to Lewis to kind of wrap us up. So thank you, Darren and Satbir.
Thank
you
you
for having us.
And thank you everybody for attending this session, and we hope you found it useful. To get to the next sessions, please go up to the main screen and click the Theater tab on the top of the event panel. The Networking Lounge, Job Board, Resource Center, and Panda Gallery are open during breaks, so please drop into network, post, and learn. Thank you, and have a great day.